welcome everyone to Forum 2.2 on how governments can embed impact for a just and resilient recovery. We've already heard today about the importance of embedding risk, return, and impact, both environmental and social, in economic and financial models. And in this session, we're going to talk about some of the bailout packages that governments have put in place as the result of COVID. But most importantly, we're going to talk about the recovery plans and what governments can do to ensure a just and resilient recovery. So to address this, we have a series of excellent speakers here, and we're going to have a very interactive dialogue with them. First, let me very briefly introduce them. We have Juan Yermo, who's Chief of Staff in the Office of the Secretary General at the OECD. Next, we have Cabinet Secretary Maina, Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development in the government of Kenya. I think she's still to join us, but hopefully will be coming shortly. Next, we have Sir Michael Barber. He's chairman and founder of Delivery Associates in the UK and has vast experience working with governments on efficiency and education and many other topics of relevance for our discussion today. And finally, representing the private sector and the investor sector, we have Kieran McLoughlin. He's managing partner of Venture Wave Capital in Ireland. So what I'd like to do is start with you, Juan. I know that the OECD was very early in working on COVID. Member governments were coming to the OECD looking for advice. The OECD already in March set up the Coronavirus Policy Hub. Can you tell us a little bit more about the implications of COVID and what the government response has been to date?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Karen. First of all, big thanks to the GSG team and in particular Ronnie for this invitation. A great pleasure to be here just to provide some initial thoughts before we give the floor to our experts here in the panel. Indeed, we've been following very closely the crisis, advising the governments, collecting the data. Since it started, we actually produce over 135 policy briefs already across the whole spectrum of policy issues. Because as you know, the crisis has affected the economic, the social, it has the environmental implications. So it's been, of course, the greatest economic, social health drama that we faced for at least the last 60 years, if not longer. So the situation, as you know, for this year is as bad as it can be, as it's been for decades. Our projections just a couple of months ago showed a decline in world GDP of the order of 6%, potentially 7%. The numbers seem to be improving in countries like China, so we may, in our next interim outlook, we may see an improvement in our projections, but still, the drama is there, the drama is in the streets, and of course the unemployment figures are also showing a worsening, a doubling, just in the OECD, a doubling in unemployment rate from about 5.3% to 10% this year. So the bailout packages, the recovery packages, or whatever you want to call them, they're not just necessary, they're absolutely critical. And without them, we would be, well, I do not even want to fathom what situation we would be if the size of those packages hadn't been of the magnitude and intensity, and also the speed of reaction was critical. Well, that is obviously the good side of the policy story. I think it's also worth flagging that we haven't really had an internationally coordinated approach. There's been a lot of national approaches, at the same time when everyone is effectively being faced with a similar crisis of a similar magnitude at pretty much the same time, with just a space of maybe weeks or months, obviously has led to what looks like a coordinated response. But the practice, as we all know, with a few exceptions, in particular the vaccine research, which is of course a critical part of the solution to the pandemic, is something that has been very much driven by national interest, and we've seen a national interest stepping in on questions such as the border closures and supply chains and the drive to ensure the local production of essential goods. So there is a whole question here about the recovery packages and the contrast with what one would say are the necessary transformations and changes needed in our economies and our societies that were already there before COVID struck. I think COVID, what it has done, it just brought to light much more vividly, for instance, the question of inequalities that we've been tracking now for decades. This increase in inequalities across OECD, but also in some non-OECD countries. And what's happened with COVID, of course, is that those inequalities are deepening because those most affected by the pandemic, whether in terms of employment, but also in terms of the health impact, are usually the most vulnerable. And here I would flag in particular the case of women, because if you just look at the situation of women in the health sector, they represent about 70% of that workforce. And women have been the one most affected in terms of also bearing the additional burdens at home of caring after children, caring after the elderly. And certainly also we've seen an increase in violence against women in domestic violence in particular as a result of the confinement. So there is a question there that needs to be addressed. And one of the issues that we are bringing to the fore in our Ministerial Council meeting taking place at the end of October is precisely this gender dimension. The other aspect is, of course, developing countries. Again, developing countries have been worse hit, maybe not so much on the health front in some cases, but certainly in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and even now also in terms of ODA in some cases, with some reductions that we've been observing recently. So this is a major concern. The debt standstill solution is something welcome, necessary, but obviously we need a clear resolution there for the situation of these high indebted countries. And debt is the other big elephant in the room. Something that will have to be addressed eventually is the big macro question. Increases in public debt of the order of 15 to 20%. Again, coming on top of a situation where we already had large increases in public debt as a result of the GFC just over a decade ago. So these are the kind of the reactions, as I said at the beginning, are necessary, but we're not there yet in terms of the transformations. And certainly the inclusiveness is one. The other big dimension is, of course, the climate, the environmental. And here I would first of all flag not just that we have, of course, the looming crisis now and approaching, but that COVID, once again, just like inequalities, has stressed the links here between the two crises. We have linkages coming as a result of air pollution. So documented evidence now how air pollution has increased the exposure, the rate of infection, and the impact of infection of COVID. We have the link between biodiversity, or rather the shrinking biodiversity, and zoonotic diseases. Again, this is not the first time, we've seen this before, but the situation keeps worsening. And thirdly, the link between access to water, or rather lack of access to water and sanitation, and of course the risk of exposure and the dangers of improving protection against COVID. So I leave it there for the time being. The recovery packages, 312 billion of that is we've been able to qualify as being part of the green recovery. So it's a good number. We're now actually going one by one through all the countries' recovery packages to try to assess the extent to which they are aligned with social inclusiveness and environmental objectives. We'll have a meeting on the 14th of September with Ministers of Environment and Finance to look into those recovery packages, to determine the greenness of those recovery packages. And of course, we have also the 1 trillion RRF, the European Union package also, which also is supposed to be aligned with green objectives. So there's a lot of money there that has been put forward by the governments. But as I said at the beginning, better international coordination, and I think we need to do a better assessment of all these public policies to really make sure that in this decade of action, we'll really accelerate those transitions that we need in terms of greater inclusiveness and tackling climate change and the biodiversity crisis.
Great, thank you so much, Juan. You talked about the interlinkages between the economy, social issues, and the environment, and we also heard that in some of the earlier sessions. And you also talked about the need for better international coordination. And you talked about some of the recovery packages and plans that are being put in place. Could you talk a little bit more about what you think will be needed to really have a resilient recovery? What types of approaches are going to be needed, and what do you think, and what is the OECD thinking in terms of what some of the key elements are going to be of that?
Yeah, very quickly, I think there are three aspects to this. There is the modeling aspect, which what you refer to as the integrated frameworks. I think this is not just it's not just an academic exercise and an interesting exercise. It's a policy must, and this exercise has to be policy oriented. It cannot remain just in the realm of academia with agent-based modeling and other approaches that are being used. This is certainly, we need the analytical solidity to back up an integrated framework, but we need to move away certainly from the traditional, certainly amongst economists, approach of just using a general equilibrium and rational expectations, perfect information, whatever it is that you call it, this beautiful theoretical word that we know we don't live in. Resilience is not just an interesting concept, it's a reality. It's something that we're living more and more in our complex and interconnected world. And that's why at the OECD we launched this initiative called New Approaches to Economic Challenges now more than 8 years ago, which precisely aims to, if not to revamp, at least to rethink a lot of our economic tools, thinking narratives, in order to bring forward an integrated framework. So we're working on that. There are other international organizations working on it. We need to advance further and fast on this. The second aspect, I think, is the evidence. And here we need more and better evidence. This is something that we do at the OECD all the time. But we have major data gaps on some important issues. And certainly on the work that the GSG is doing on impact, this is a very important area where we need to get a better understanding what we mean by social impact. We need to think about the methodologies and how we measure that. And the third is the question of how we communicate, and in particular how policymakers communicate their actions. And here we do some mea culpa, because we are the first one to always put GDP at the forefront of all our publications, and every other international organization and economic research think tank, they do that. But clearly we need to go beyond GDP. We've been talking about this now for a decade. We produce well-being indicators. They're not fully integrated with our reporting on the more traditional macro indicators. This is an area that we need to improve. It's about communicating to politicians, to leaders, to ministers, that it's not just about GDP, that you need to think about the quality of life. You need to think about of course, the health aspect. You need to think about pollution. You need to think about your natural assets. And of course, you need to think about the distribution of income and wealth in your society. You need to see this as more of a dashboard of indicators of your success in achieving progress for the well-being of your society, rather than just a single GDP number as your ultimate goal.
Great, thank you, Juan. And I know also that the OECD recently launched a new WISE Center focused on well-being, inclusiveness, sustainability, and equality. So we look forward to seeing the great work that will come out of that. So I'd like to turn now to Sir Michael, who has, as I mentioned earlier, has been doing a lot of work with governments, helping them aim to become more efficient. That's never been more important than it is today. Michael, I'd love to hear from you about what is it that governments can do at this time when resources are scarce and will be increasingly scarce going forward. How can governments be more efficient and build back better?
Thank you, Kieran, for the question. And yes, I'm interested in efficiency, but also effectiveness. Do they get the job done? And I'm really welcome the GSG putting on this particular workshop, because I think the theme is very important. If anybody wants to follow up in more detail what I'm going to say, I've put a presentation on the website of the GSG conference that has a bit more detail than we can do in a brief session. One way to see this pandemic actually is as a test for government. For the first time in history, every government has been given the same homework assignment at the same time. And so we can begin to see how they're managing. And Juan made the very important point that there hasn't been a lot of global coordination, and there should be more, because the sooner countries learn from each other and coordinate, the faster we will get on top of this huge challenge. Another way to see the pandemic is as a rehearsal for the climate change and biodiversity crises that are coming down the track. The pandemic is making us change the way we live our lives. It's forcing us to do that. We're all doing things now that we wouldn't even imagine doing in December or January. The biodiversity and climate change crisis will have a similar impact if we just let it unfold. It would be much better if we anticipate it and start changing how we live in a thoughtful, credible way right now. But it will mean we have to change how we live. And the thing that relates particularly to the GSG summit and its whole agenda is, if we're going to change how we live, we have to change what we value and how we measure what we value. And Ronnie Cohen, who's an inspiration to all of us, has set out in his book Impact how important it is that businesses no longer just focus on profit, but they focus on social impact and environmental impact as well. The problem in the second half of the 20th century was basically we ended up with an equation governing business, which was that value equals price. The problem with that is, simple though it isn't true, because you can externalize costs, you can do damage to the environment, but it doesn't affect your price and the value judged in that way of your goods. So that's been the problem in the private sector, and we need to move on to the kind of agenda that Ronnie Cohen has been leading the way on. And I know Kieran and others are thinking along these lines. In the public sector, the equivalent simple equation that's got in the way of things is that inputs equal outcomes. So the British government was recently re-elected on, among other things, a promise of having 20,000 extra police officers. I'm in favour of it, as it happens. But actually what we need to know as citizens is, what will those 20,000 police officers do all day, and what changes will they bring in our lives? So the inputs don't equal the outcomes. And all across the developing world, for example, you can see school systems building schools, but the outcomes are awful. They build three schools every day just to keep up with population growth in Egypt, but the education outcomes are terrible. So the inputs don't equal the outputs, but that's what we've assumed for most of the last 50 or 60 years. I've been doing work for the UK Treasury, which I hope will come through in the forthcoming spending review, based on a report that they published in my name in 2017. If anybody wants to go to the Treasury website and find it, on public value. How do you measure the value of public expenditure? Because inputs equal outcomes is just not good enough. And what we say in the report is that 4 things represent good public value. The first is, does the money you allocate actually deliver the outcomes you hope? So when you allocate 300 million to tackle mental health, for example, what change are you trying to bring about, and how would you know you'd achieved it? So what are the medium-term goals over a 3 or 4 year period for that sum of money? That's what I did in the Blair administration, making sure that money got turned into health and education and other outcomes. So that's the first part of public value, but on its own, it's not enough. The second part of public value is Karen's efficiency point. Are the inputs being spent efficiently and well? Are they being spent on what they were intended to be spent on? Is there any corruption? Is there any inefficiency? Is any money being sort of diluted out of the system? So point 1 of public value is meeting the medium-term goals. Point 2 is spending the inputs efficiently. Point 3, new to most governments, is engagement. Most of the money we spend will only really deliver great outcomes if the recipients, the beneficiaries, engage. If you put a child into school, the harder they work, the better they'll do, even if you don't spend extra money. If you fund a student through university, if they engage, they will get better outcomes. If you want to solve mental health, it doesn't matter how much money you spend if the sufferer doesn't actually engage, or the sufferer's family and friends help the sufferer engage. So the third measure of public value is, are you engaging the users of the service and the citizens beyond that? The citizens need to at least understand, but the users need to engage. And then the fourth part of public value is stewardship. Are you leaving whatever you're responsible for better than you found it? If you're a principal of a school, is it better when you leave than it was when you started? Have the staff got more skills? Is the institution more resilient? Has it got better relationships with the community? And last but not least, is its environmental impact managed and thought about in a constructive way? So if you have any chunk of public expenditure, the whole of government expenditure, or a particular slug of it, is it delivering goals? Are the inputs well spent? Are you engaging the people who are meant to be benefiting from this? And are you exercising stewardship? If you do those things, you will get value that the public value. And that's why I think that fits really well with the impact investment agenda, which this GSG summit promotes.
Great, thank you so much for that. And your 4 points are very clear and really resonate. But this really requires a huge mindset change and behavioral change. So in your work with governments, how have you been able to instill that mindset change and get them to think differently? And how can we leverage this COVID opportunity to speed that up?
Well, I think it's a great question, and some of it is technical. How do you measure public value? But a lot of it is actually how you think about public policy, and even more importantly, how you explain public policy to the population of a country, and the language we use about politics. And it's not just governments that talk continuously about inputs, it's what the populations of countries expect a lot of the time. So, you know, ministers like to announce that they're dealing with technology in schools, and they say we've provided X thousand laptops. But very often you visit a school and you find the laptops are still wrapped in plastic and they're gathering dust because the teachers don't know how to use them, or there's no Wi-Fi or whatever it might be. So you've got to think about the outcomes that you want. And that involves a change in the language and the dialogue about political value that you have with citizens. So some of it's technical and some of it's about the processes you put in place, and some of it is about the language you use to explain. And the COVID crisis should remind people just how important government is. Like, I mean, Juan made this point. It's been a terrible crisis, but it would have been a lot worse if governments hadn't been able to react rapidly. They haven't been perfect, of course, they're dealing with something new, but they have shown their value. And so that should change our ability to understand what governments can do and how they can work. And they've also, the countries that have done best in managing the COVID-19 crisis have, one of the things they've done better than other countries is the dialogue with their citizens. So the COVID is testing governments in exactly the ways you want to test them in anticipation of the climate change crisis ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Kieran, I now want to turn to you, and great to have a private sector investor representative on the panel. But actually I wanted to continue with this discussion about the role of government. Maybe if you could touch on that first.
I'd be delighted to, Karen, and it's a pleasure to join this panel of such estimable experts. In fact, I had a few thoughts in my, few feeble thoughts, I might say, in my head before coming on. But I think the discussion between Juan and Michael, is an excellent one. If I may, Karen, want to just pick up on some of the points that have been made here, because I think there's a some very cogent outcomes of what both Juan and Sir Michael have said. I think we're at an extraordinary point, juncture in history. Sir Michael talks about the new dialogue between governments and their people. It's quite fascinating that after decades of policies of rolling back the state, we have seen the state restored to its place of centrality in terms of determining and delivering public policy, and not just in economic terms, but in social terms, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the consensus now has been to put the welfare of people's health ahead of economic growth, et cetera. And the state, as the primary provider of private goods, is the only agency that can do that. I think the public discourse has changed dramatically as well. People have endured great hardship, loss of incomes, loss of welfare, et cetera, not to speak, of course, the ultimate loss of life. But there have been gains, cleaner air, less travel times, less commuting, etc., more times at home, greater activity in the regions, greater work-life balance, all ESG values that people have become more accustomed to, and they're not going to surrender those. So in a sense, the ESG agenda has become actioned upon by default. And the state cannot ignore that. Rather, the state is embracing that. The third key player in all of this, of course, is the business world. And I like to think that the business community has acquitted itself rather well throughout these crises. You've seen employers readily accommodate people in terms of remote working, etc., something that would have been anathema prior to the onset of the crisis. Companies have done their very, very best to maintain their employees, you know, despite the strain on their capital base and their reserves, etc. You've seen the rush to provide PPE and now to accelerate investment in medtech, remote diagnostics, etc. So one is seeing, I believe, almost a confluence of interests here, with the state in the lead, public discourse and public opinion and priorities becoming more ESG compliant, and business willing to play its part. And it's interesting when you talk about government. We, in the land of never-ending political intrigue here in Ireland, we had an election in February which was gloriously inconclusive. So we didn't have a government appointed until the end of June. So that's what is interesting about that is we have the first effective COVID government, not the first, but one of the first COVID governments, and their program is a program that would have been unthinkable prior to the crisis. It's a very radical, almost neo-Keynesian prescription for government, with a heavy emphasis on infrastructural spending, etc. A lot of it to be funded through carbon tax. So, for instance, you know, they're proposing going to enact a tenfold increase in carbon taxes. Those taxes will be designated, and we all know governments are very reluctant to ring-fence taxes, but they will be designated to reducing fuel poverty, to retrofitting 500,000 homes to bring their energy levels up, and to enabling the agricultural sector transform and transition to a carbon neutral methodology. There's going to be a very heavy investment in public transport associated with a ban on the licensing of fossil fuel vehicles from 2030. And in that very increased transport budget, 10% of the budget will be provided for cycle initiatives to promote cycling, and 10% for pedestrianisation, which is really rather interesting. It's envisaging a new, greener, more regionalized world, etc. So I think there's a whole confluence of events, state in the lead, public opinion clearer, and the business community wanting to play its part.
Great, thanks Kieran for that. You talked about ESG, and of course ESG is very much about compliance, which is great. It's great that it's really catching on in more and more countries, and more companies are reporting according to ESG. There's an OECD publication coming out, the Business and Finance Outlook, at the end of September, that talks about some of the opportunities and challenges of that. But how can we ensure that we go beyond compliance and really move towards aiming to have a positive impact on the environment and society? And maybe here you could put on your investor hat and give us your views as an impact investor.
Well, I think the first thing to perhaps highlight is the fact that within the investor community, ESG values have been embraced. The investor community is not just reacting to the current crisis. In fact, what this crisis allows investors to do is amplify their commitment to ESG values and seek out new opportunities. I mean, earlier this morning, Sarani spoke about the pronouncements from the Business Roundtable in the United States. Yes, a very conservative body of some of the leading CEOs of the world, who proclaimed really the death of shareholder capitalism and a move to stakeholder capitalism. So that change, that transformation is underway. I think from the investment point of view, we have two key challenges. One is the measurement challenge, obviously. In the absence of generally accepted indices and data, there's a lot of cynicism about lip service, greenwashing, et cetera, that all has to be eliminated, and we need some coherent, scientifically based method of measuring impact and measuring the performance of companies relative to that. The other is to pick up on a point that Juan made, which is all about communications. I think it's marvelous that the OECD is moving from a GDP focused or centric series of measurements. We need to do the same thing. Companies have to be much more broad in their treatment of themselves and the reporting of their activities, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, Brian Moynihan, who's a leader in this whole area, the CEO of Bank of America, has put it on record that he expects ESG statements to be included on all financial audits within the next 5 years, which would be a very, very welcome thing.
Great, and I understand he's also the chair of the World Economic Forum International Business Council, which also has put forward an initiative on measurement, measuring beyond ESG, and they're involved with some other international work in that area, along with those. Great, well, unfortunately, I don't know if we have the Cabinet Secretary with us yet. I know that she's been trying to connect. But otherwise, I'd like to continue our very good discussion here. So we've talked about efficiency and effectiveness, and we've talked about finance. But of course, we know that it's not just about the money, it's really about innovation and about developing new approaches. If we keep doing things the way we've been doing them, even more money, creative ways of bringing private sector money, et cetera, isn't going to solve all of the growing challenges that we have. So could each of you talk a little bit, or whoever would like to raise their hand, talk a bit more about the role of innovation and the kind of new approaches that we need if we're really going to have a resilient and just recovery? Just raise your hand if you'd like to jump in. Yes.
I'm happy to start just briefly, but I'd love to hear from the others. I very much welcome the remarks that Kieran just made about business, and actually underlying his remarks was a real sense of optimism about the opportunity we have here, which I think is important to hang on to in what are very troubled times. I think innovation, there's nothing like a crisis, as we know, to drive some innovation. So that in itself may prompt innovation, for example, in vaccine development and vaccine delivery when we get to that stage. But I think the bigger issue is how you get. I'll think just about public money and governments. How you get innovation from public investment. Governments find it hard to take big innovation risks because you live in a media environment. You get slaughtered if things go wrong. It's very tough, and that's why I think impact investing, part funded and encouraged by government, is a really good way forward. And some of the work that the original impact investment funds that Ronnie Cohen helped develop for the British government have demonstrated that. So I think one is for government to get braver about doing things in that way. The second area I would look at is regulation. So how do you regulate? I'm chair of the British institution that regulates the university sector, and you want to establish a regulatory framework that encourages, even incentivizes innovation rather than inhibits it and gets in the way of it. And that's easy to say in a short panel like this, but quite hard to do in practice. So we're thinking that through in relation to the university sector, but all regulators need to think about that. And to me, doing that in the context of public value, meeting the medium-term targets, spending the money well, engaging users, that's another source of innovation, and thinking about stewardship, all of these can contribute.
Great, thank you. I know that the other speakers would like to come in on this as well, but I believe we have the Cabinet Secretary here with us. And if that's the case, I would like to warmly welcome her and invite her to share her perspective from Kenya in terms of how government is responding to the crisis and what can be done in developing countries and beyond to really embed impact into the recovery. Cabinet Secretary, are you here with us? Okay, I guess not. I see her team, but okay, they'll let me know when she comes in. So then, Kieran, I'll turn to you because we were talking earlier today, and I think you would violently agree with what Sir Michael has just said. But do you want to add anything to that?
No, I do agree violently, if that's the appropriate term, with what Sir Michael has said. You know, what I have found is that the motivation of our investor base is very, very pure. It's very ambitious, but it's very pure. That they do want to achieve social change through their investments, and they are willing, if necessary, to take a lower commercial return on that. You know, and I think that the test of that motivation is the fact that there are far safer and easier routes to generate a return than becoming engaged in impact investing, which by its nature is high risk because one is trying to achieve outcomes that are economically positive as well as socially positive. So that means that, you know, the innovation in the actual product, our service, our technology has to meet a number of measures to be successful. And I think in terms of communications, there is both an opportunity and a challenge to the investor and the commercial community here to prove that to re-acquit capitalism. Capitalism is not bad. It's going to be the generator of the wealth which will provide the social change. And I think that's a message. We talk about governments communicating with their people. The investment community and business has to do that to the population. Say, look, we're in step with ESG values. We want to achieve them, and we want to be conscientious capitalists. Bono sums this up wonderfully when he says that capitalism is not immoral, it's amoral. It needs guidance. And I think it's incumbent upon the investment community, the entrepreneurial community to take leadership in that regard and to show that it shares the same goals as governments, as the public, and that we take advantage of the situation we're in now to create a better world.
So Kieran, in your comments, you implied, and I don't believe you meant it, but you implied that there could be a trade-off between return and impact. Could you address that?
There can be, but it's not at all necessary. Again, you know, profit is not a bad thing. It's not a grubby word. It's a great motivator. But the wealth it creates, so long as that's applied generally and sensibly and morally, that is the key outcome that we all desire.
And, you know, I think we've seen a lot of evidence that investing in the right things also can mean that you have a better return, and certainly over the longer term, because what's material today versus tomorrow, this is changing, of course. And so the environmental and social impacts are becoming more and more material over time. But that's for another discussion. I want to turn to Juan, because I assume you would like to come in on this topic of innovation as well, given all of the work at OECD in this area.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Of course, innovation is at the heart of productivity enhancement. So clearly, this should be at the core of public policy. And I think what the pandemic reminds us is of the importance of basic fundamental research. It's about vaccines research, but it's about more broadly about fundamental research that often goes underfunded and increasingly underfunded under tight budgets. And this is obviously a major concern because fundamental research can mainly be supported by the state. So you talk about pandemics, you talk about diseases, but similarly you talk about some of the most important breakthroughs in technology over the last decades have had at the core some form of state support. Maybe small, maybe it was just initiated like the internet, you know, in a small initiative, but then got big support from the Defense Department in the US. But like that, there are many examples. I mean, the whole artificial intelligence industry also is very much linked to some of the fundamental research that has been supported by government. So the vaccines and this case of COVID is just one more reminder of, I think it was Michael who was mentioning yesterday, earlier, about we need to think again the role of the state. And retrenching the state for the sake of it, for ideological reasons, is obviously can lead us to situations like the ones we faced when we were caught unprepared with masks, we were unprepared with testing, we were unprepared in so many different ways for this crisis, even though we had trials in a way of such a health crisis over the last decade, including coronavirus very recently, where the research was stopped because of lack of incentives, lack of sufficient public money. So there is here a question of innovation. Certainly on the digital front, there is a lot still the governments need to do. If you just look at across the OECD, broadband access, the gaps in broadband access are so huge between the ones that are most advanced, you know, the Koreans, the Estonians, compared to other countries of the OECD where you don't have that broadband access, including some of our most important, or not enough, including most important European countries. And then we need to think about innovation in the state itself, in the role of the state. This question of policy integration, of coherence. How can we still, you know, OECD and G20 governments are still, you know, subsidized to the tune of 180 billion, fossil fuel industries? And how come we don't have, you know, carbon pricing at the adequate level at more than 25% of emissions? So there's clearly a lot of has to be done still on the policy front.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I've gotten the warning sign that we're going to disappear in 3 minutes. So I wanted to give each of you a chance to give a 1 minute final closing comments and perhaps recommendations for the esteemed members of this GSG community. Michael, I'll start with you.
Some years ago, I had a conversation with a guy half my age. He was in his, this was 10 years ago, he was in his late 20s. We were... Sorry,
we have 1 minute. One minute each.
Yeah. And I said to him, we were between meetings, I said to him, what do you think the 21st century is going to be like? I'll be dead before the end of it, but you might last for the whole of it. What do you think it's going to be like? He said, it's going to be fantastic as long as we get through the first half of the century first. And I think that's what the issue is. So we as a group have a responsibility to get through the first half of the 21st century, so the generations behind can enjoy the second half of the 21st century, and the things we're debating are central to that.
Great, thank you. Kieran?
I agree. I think it will be fantastic. I'm actually very, very optimistic because of the convergence of a clear articulation on the part of the public of their desire for ESG values, a re-establishment of the authority of the state in pursuing those values, and an openness from the business community to engage in that endeavor. So I think the future is good.
Thank you. Juan?
Well, my closing message would be that we need more, not less, but certainly more effective multilateralism and international cooperation.
Yes, here.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I wanted to thank all of the speakers. Clearly, we have quite an agenda ahead, and this is really the time to act. We have an opportunity with COVID, and a lot of experts and people from government, from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, really wanting to work together to build for a better recovery. So with that, I want to thank you all again, and I also wanted to thank the GSG and Rafaela for supporting us in this session.
Thanks so much.